Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. It is my great pleasure to welcome you to the Berlin Science Week Falling Wall Circle Table on Foresight, how to avoid another 2020. My name is Chris Lubkeman. I'm the head of Foresight at the ETH in Zurich, and it is my incredible pleasure welcome table to gate, our breakfast table, our lunch table, our dinner table, three friends who have been in Foresight most of their professional lives in one way or another. Peter Ho comes to us from Singapore. He is currently the senior advisor to the Center for Strategic Futures, a senior fellow in the Civil Service College, and a visiting fellow at the Lee Kuan-Yew School of Public Policy. He doesn't really want me to tell you, but he's also chairman of 5 national organizations, on another 5 boards, and just an incredibly humble and wonderful person. So Peter, welcome.
Hi.
Great to see you here. And we've known each other for 20 years, which is hard to imagine. Next up, to his left, we have Crystal van der Elst. And Crystal, you, as you know, are the Director General of Policy Horizons, helping Canada to look ahead and to make sure that Canada is leading in the best way that it can. You are the CEO of the Global Foresight Group, former head of strategic foresight at the World Economic Forum, and a member of the OECD Governmental Foresight Community. And we met each other at WEF about 16 years ago. Welcome, Crystal.
Thank you.
Great to have you here. And you're here from Ottawa, I believe, where it's
6 in the morning.
And beautiful. At 6 in the morning. Well, we thank you so much for Cornelia de Heim is our last table guest. And Cornelia, we know each other since about 18 years. We met when you were with the Foresight Company, and you were there for about 15 years, I think you were there. And now you have your own Foresight Consultancy, the founder and director of Future Impacts, a Foresight research and consulting company. And you have been working on Foresight projects all over the world, and especially have been involved with the Association for Professional Futurists and helping make sure that we're pushing and maintaining our Foresight society and capacity all over. And I think this has been something I've done. And we met, as I think I said, 18 years ago and had a great conversation as you reminded me about Winnie the Pooh. Is that correct?
We did.
Welcome.
More details later, maybe. Thank you very much, Chris. Pleasure to be with you all.
Thank you. Our conversation today is about foresight, and as in the title, the promise is we're going to help us all understand how to avoid another 2020. I'm not exactly sure how we're going to do that, because once 2020 is gone, we can never repeat it anyway. We move into 2021. But I think we all know what we mean by the implication of this, because foresight is really, for us, about a way of crafting meaningful conversations about the possibilities of the context or contexts to come. And so I'd like to start out by asking everybody on the table a question, but I'd like to remind all of our viewers that you are also part of our table. You are the 5th guest, and it's very important for us that you participate. So you can, in the chat, send in questions, and they will be accumulated and put forward to me, where I will be able to put those to our guests. So please take that 5th chair at our table and join with us. So I'd like to ask all of you, so what surprised you? If you were Foresight professionals, we're not supposed to be surprised by much, or are we? So what surprised you this coming year? So who'd like to start? Thank you for volunteering.
I'm happy to
Okay.
start.
Okay, Crystal, you go ahead and start. What surprised you?
Okay. Maybe just before I talk, I just want to say that I'm not, the views are mine that I'm expressing at this table and not necessarily the views of the government of Canada. So I am not, as you said, we're not that often surprised actually, because of course, like doing this work for like 15, 20 years, you've seen quite a lot. Your kind of spectrum of what you think is plausible and possible is quite broad. But I was thinking that for today, maybe one of the interesting things I could contribute here, given kind of the audience and the type of stuff we do and what the Falling Wall Circle Table is about, is maybe reflect a bit on kind of the nexus between science policy, science advice, policy making, and foresight. Because looking back at the past year, that nexus has proven to be incredibly important. And if we move forward, when we want to avoid another of those kind of fun years, then we might want to reflect on that nexus and how that might be playing out. So we've seen a lot of challenge to evidence, as you know, to evidence-based policy, to trust in science. And it seems that a lot of people have been kind of surprised about that. There seems to be, this assumption that knowledge, kind of data leads to knowledge, leads to kind of the right decisions and right behaviors. It's all kind of linear and straightforward. But the fact is that all this was happening actually on the background of an already existing trend, which was a decrease in the credibility of expertise. We've been talking about this for several years now. So on top of that, the whole crisis of the whole COVID-19 virus has provided a lot of novelty, to say so. So we didn't know the virus, we didn't know how things were progressing, what the impact was, how it was, the trajectory was going to be. And so ultimately, we found ourselves in a situation where it's more important to have good interpretive skills than accurate knowledge to make kind of decisions. We've also seen a lot of difficulties, I think, in thinking structurally. So thinking about the COVID pandemic, as of course it is a sanitary crisis, it's a health crisis, but it's also an economic and social crisis, potentially a geopolitical crisis. So just as the world started kind of to think about what are some of the solutions in that space or the trade-offs to be made, we started to see that everything was really, obviously, I mean, the world started to see everything was connected, and just that systemic thinking was quite difficult. And we also saw the increased pluralism, also an ongoing trend, but that played also out very much in this COVID crisis. We can't just assume that everyone's expectations, values, needs, wants, preferences are just uniform and the same. So we saw in certain countries some challenges on the overarching kind of public health first kind of narrative, and people start to make a lot of trade-offs, which is one of the reasons, obviously, why we're back kind of in a wave, because people start to make trade-offs between that and their own personal needs, the needs, financial needs, emotional needs for connection, etc. And then maybe a last thing is that this uncertainty came on top of other uncertainty. Right, so we were already in kind of a world where everything was changing. People were nervous about automation, changing geopolitics, etc., increasing inequality, and now comes COVID as kind of a shock. And so people, as a lot of people don't, in most of crisis, people tend to kind of worry, right? Engage with the future in a way of worrying what might happen, in quite an unstructured way. Which holds a risk for knee-jerk reactions, obviously, or just no decisions. And so amid all that, actually, we've seen a great increase actually for demanding strategic foresight, because it provides really an alternative to all of that. And at least we have seen a great demand actually for providing foresight, because strategic foresight actually provides kind of that sense-making tool that helps us make sense systemically about things. It allows us to have conversations about the future. It allows us to actually really engage more strategically. So that's kind of something to think about for your community, I think, for the audience here.
Yeah. That's great. Thank you very much. It's a good menu that we can dig into in a little bit. Ask Peter and Cornelia, what surprised you about 2020?
Yeah, maybe I can build on what, is that okay? I can build on what Crystal
Sure,
said.
Cornelia.
Yeah. Okay.
Sure, you build on that, and then Peter, you're gonna come in after. How's that? Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Super. Crystal, many interesting points, I think, and you're spot on about the risk for the knee-jerk reactions, I think, with the lack of sort of systemic preparedness maybe we are seeing, and the struggling with the uncertainty. So, but I would like to take, in addition to this top-level look at the experience we've had this year of experience in a really globally interconnected crisis. Look a bit more at these sort of maybe paradoxes we are especially seeing in Foresight. So there were many questions also around why haven't we been more prepared? And I think what we're learning is also that in a situation where we are in the midst of a global crisis, there is an increased complexity of sense making, maybe on the individual level, that we are struggling with. And even though many aspects of the crisis have been on the radar and there had been backup plans and so on, that doesn't translate to making the experience comfortable on the individual level and having a sense of understanding and a sense of how can we cooperate more. And maybe to look at, and that's, I think, something we can try to build on more with the question of how can we translate that knowledge that's out there into being really prepared for action, which is in fact really, as Crystal said, not a linear connection so far, and maybe can never be. And to look at the surprises, I would like to look at the really local level, what surprised me here, and maybe can give us also a bit of hope in this tough situation that we are still in. And that to me was the speed of innovation and solidarity movements that popped up, as far as I can see, in many countries, but for Germany, I can for sure confirm sort of bottom-up solidarity movements organized by the people locally, connecting via digital means, where we can for sure see that this is a strong trend also that has now been accelerated by the crisis. Also with an increased cooperation between public sector and the wider population, you could say. So that's maybe one aspect where we have seen bottom-up innovation really moving very fast in a crisis situation to deal with a couple of the immediate impacts that I think are a very positive trend that we have witnessed in many cases. And the second one on that positive surprise level was to me also resonating a lot with what Crystal said, which was around how we communicate in this crisis. And I think we've seen also in several countries, for Germany, there are a couple of high-profile cases of scientists stepping up strongly to communicate to the wider public, of people in the public sector reaching out more and more via social media. Our chancellor also is communicating via video podcast, which he had also done before, but we have many new means of where there's an increased form of communication that's outside of the traditional media sphere, and that seems to contribute a lot also in a positive sense of getting information out there and explaining it well. So these would be two positive surprises I would like to highlight.
Yeah, the power, if you will, of these the power and the peril of these new media methods. So, Peter,
Well,
what
the
surprised
question
you?
is what surprised us? And I must say, taking a slightly contrarian view, that there's not very much that happened in the last couple of years that was a big surprise to me. in a way, my surprise was that people were surprised by what happened. Uh, and if you think about it, and this builds on Crystal's point, there were a lot of things happening which were building up towards 2020, whether you think about the geopolitical situation, the tensions between the US and China, whether you think about climate change, and we definitely have seen uh, records being broken on the climate change front in the last few years. And when you think about something like COVID, certainly it's been a big shock to the whole system. But in a sense, we shouldn't be surprised because uh, the next big one, people expected that there would be a pandemic. Yet when it happened, we were all, at least apparently, surprised by it, and our responses to it around the world showed how unprepared we were. So we were caught by surprise in that sense. But in a sense, uh, you know, we shouldn't be surprised when things happen, because the world we live in is a highly complex, highly uncertain world, and surprises will always happen. 2020 may look like a particularly bad year, but there will be surprises in 2021, 2022, and so on. And the question, I guess, for us is, uh, when we see trends building up to something, do we prepare for it? And unfortunately, COVID tells us that very often, even when we see there's a potential problem, we often don't prepare for it. And of course, there are many reasons. Some people say that uh, COVID pandemic was a black swan. That means a, a big surprise. But in my view, it wasn't really a big surprise. We've had so many forewarnings that something bad could happen on the pandemic front. And just look back in the last century, there was the Spanish flu, 1918. Then we had the Hong Kong flu. Then, as recently as 2003, the SARS outbreak. And then we've had things like swine flu, H1N1, MERS, and Ebola. All these were warning signs that something big was around the corner. And nevertheless, when it happened, we were all caught by surprise. And I think we are paying the price for this. Question is, what can we do about it? And I think this is something that is worth discussing further into this lunch or breakfast or dinner.
I think so. You actually have a name for this because you say it's not a black swan. It's a
Yeah, I think of COVID not as a black swan, but as a black elephant. In other words, the pandemic is the big elephant in the room. It's staring at you. You've got all the evidence that humanity confronts pandemics every now and then. Yet, in spite of that, we tend to ignore the warning signs and all the warnings of experts, and we do nothing about it. And of course, when the problem blows up, we pretend as if it was a black swan. We pretend to be shocked. But in fact, the problem was staring us in the face all the time. Now, the reason for this is a human condition. We are all prone to our own cognitive biases. And one of a particular cognitive bias which contributes to this problem is the cognitive bias of hyperbolic discounting. The concept in which people would rather deal with a fire burning in front of them than pay an insurance premium for something like a pandemic that may or may not happen in the far distant future. And hopefully it doesn't happen on my watch.
yeah.
So that's a problem, and it's a huge problem in dealing with these kind of surprises. governments are very prone to this kind of problem.
Yeah, because I guess so many demands upon us at the moment about to think real cycle. So that's so Cornelia, and then I'm gonna ask Crystal a question about scenarios, and so Cornelia, go ahead and pop an answer, and then.
Yeah, I'd just like to react to what Peter says, because I think that is maybe the key question we should take away from this experience in the foresight profession, because as Peter lined out, it was staring us in the face. It was indeed a black elephant, which I like as an image, which is, I think, quite clear. It has been in the big reports. Look through the Millennium Project reports, for example, of the state of the future over the last 10 years, it was in there, and it was not that they came up with it. There were other examples of the large foresight reports which had those pandemic probabilities in there, and the WHO had been warning about it, and so on. And I know many countries also had a risk preparedness plan around it, but still then it's tough when it occurs. So for me, I have a theory around that we are not yet at the threshold of where foresight is diffused enough to really get us to a preparedness around the major risks we are seeing, because the short term, the fires in front of you as you are facing it are always louder, stronger, and also the systemic incentives we have for what is rewarded in your job, in how organizations work, are oriented towards the short term. And as far as I know, there is no solution yet to building into the systems rewards, incentives for avoiding a risk in the long term, in 10 years, 15 years, 2 years, whatever. So this we have not yet figured out, and that would be a big question to tackle. And the thing maybe we can immediately do is try to, if my theory is right, that we have not diffused enough, although we have improved, to diffuse more deeply into the organizations to get this kind of thinking more ingrained.
So I'm going to skip my question I was going to ask right at that point, but I think that's a really great point you just bring up is, how do we get foresight thinking more diffused or more permeating into our various governments and our organizations? And I'm going to come, because Crystal, you came to Canada to Policy Horizon, I believe, to help evolve that exact mistaken. Or I'm actually on this one, but what's your view? And what are you trying to do there in Canada? And then Peter, I want you to tell us what's happening in Singapore with this after Crystal tells us.
Yeah. So in Canada, there was a couple of years ago. I mean, there's been foresight going on since a long time, and it's one of the countries that invests together with Singapore, etc., very heavily in foresight, actually. However, as everywhere, sometimes the question is like, how much does your foresight actually lead into decision making and into impact? So we're kind of on a strategic plan to make sure that happens. So a couple of things that we're doing. We're obviously doing our base research on some of the, on some of the big disruptions that we might be seeing. So that's always something that we have the time for, actually. It's good to have a center or a hub kind of people who can take the time to actually think about the potential disruptions. But it's not sufficient to just have that as a unit. So we have also a huge engagement team compared to other governments I'm talking, that make sure that all the thinking that we're doing is actually being implemented in real decision making. So we engage a lot with the policymakers, the people who actually make the decisions, right? And we're kind of in support of them to help them take the future into account. So we do that through content, but also through processes. So we support them in processes. So, and then something else where, we have many ways of doing that at all types of levels. But one of the key things also that we're doing is building up the foresight muscle of the rest of the organization. Ultimately, we're only going to get there actually if we develop if policymakers become kind of good users or foresight thinkers themselves, even if they don't produce the whole foresight, but that they're good consumers and that they have this muscle of thinking about the future. And so we do a lot of capacity building there. So that's kind of, in a nutshell, how we hope to diffuse it in the system.
That's great. So researching trends and disruptions, having a team to do that. Then you have an engagement team, and then actually helping to exercise the muscle. I think that's really fantastic. Now, Peter, in Singapore is very well known globally as having some of the best foresight practitioners and practice. So, what? Tell us how are you doing it there, and is it the same as Crystal, or what's?
Well, the Singapore experience is a bit different. The and don't forget, this is a capability that has been built up now, I think, over 35 plus years. So it's a very long time. And it's not something that happened overnight. But it started with a very simple problem. And that problem was uh, how do you make better decisions when you know that there's a lot of uncertainty ahead? And we looked around and we settled on scenario planning, not because it was a perfect methodology, but partly because Shell, which developed the scenario planning, has a very strong presence in Singapore, and they were prepared to help us. So they helped us develop our thinking around scenario planning.
Hmm.
Initially, scenario planning was adopted only within one ministry, that is the Ministry of Defense. And then the government said, well, it's something that looks like it's a good idea to adopt for the whole of government. And indeed, that's what happened. A scenario planning office was set up in the Prime Minister's office, and we started to do national scenarios. I believe we are one of the few, if not the only government to do scenario planning at the national level. Very importantly, it's a process that involves the whole of government. That means all the ministries, all the agencies are involved in the process. That means they have to all take their marking for their own plans from the national scenarios. uh, they need to be taught the process. They need to embrace the vocabulary of scenario planning, and that's in fact what happened. And the budget cycle and all that are all tied to and interlinked with the national scenario planning process. Now, of course, what happened was, as we gained experience, we discovered that scenario planning is not doesn't solve all your problems. In fact, after we experienced in Singapore events like the Asian financial crisis, the in after the 911, there was Jamaah Islamiyah terrorist network that was uncovered in Southeast Asia. After the SARS outbreak in 2003, we realized that scenario planning often didn't prepare us for such surprises. So, to cut a long story short, that led us to develop other tools, which we added to the scenario planning baseline, and we call it Scenario Planning Plus. That toolkit is under the care of a think tank which was set up called the Center for Strategic Futures. And that center helps to promote the methodology, but also tries to identify emerging strategic issues that could become important in the future, and which the other agencies are not looking at. So there are many things which have to be done, but
Right.
I think the critical factor is the leadership has to take this seriously. It's no point just doing all of these things if the leadership doesn't take it seriously. If the leadership doesn't take it seriously, it comes to nothing.
Hmm.
So at least in Singapore's case, we have been, I guess, fortunate that the leadership has taken strategic foresight, scenario planning, all very seriously.
Yeah.
So that, I think, is a critical success factor.
So that's thank you very much, Peter. That's a nice, I think, a fourth one to add onto our list of, this how to avoid another 2020. We do some research. We have to engage. We have to build the foresight muscle, and we need to have leaders
Yeah.
who understand this sort of decision-making process. I think that's really fantastic. So, but you do one more thing, and then Cornelia, I'm going to come to you. You also do something, I believe, which is similar to what Crystal was saying, was the building capacity, or actually exercising a muscle, and that is that you have people within government who rotate through foresight. I mean, it's almost like a mandatory stop on their career path, right? I mean, so it's not just you have 5 people and they do that the rest of their lives. Is that correct?
We make it mandatory because the thing you have to appreciate is not everybody has the right temperament for doing this kind of strategic foresight. They have to be prepared to move beyond conventional thinking. They have to think out of their box. They have to have a lot of they have to have broad interests, and they have to be interested in everything, because in strategic foresight, an essential skill is the ability to connect many seemingly unrelated issues. So generally, we do rotate people through, but we don't rotate everybody. It's only people with that breadth of interest. We do try to bring in people who are young, who are smart, who are prepared to challenge orthodoxy, because when they're relatively young, they have not been captured by groupthink. They have not been captured by the establishment, so they are more prepared to be open to new ideas. And it's very critical in strategic foresight, in futures thinking, to be open to ideas that may not conform to mainstream thinking. So it's a very important that we choose the right people with the right temperament. And importantly, in the Center for Strategic Futures, we don't keep them longer than about 3 years or so. And after that, we move them out. And they've gained something. They like the experience, but they move on to other things.
Thank you very much for Peter. I think that's really good. So Cornelia, I know you work both with civil society and with corporates now, especially focused helping to build capacity to help these groups understand how foresight can help them and to help them become the best version of themselves. You just heard Crystal and Peter share some of their thoughts on what some of their on what to do, how they're doing it. Tell us what you're seeing and what you think.
Yeah, I think there might even be a kind of consensus or shared view of what are the key levers to do that. In the practices, as we've been trying to help organizations, companies, and public sector to increase their foresight capacity, we call it. So their ability to think about the long term, make sense of it, and translate it into action. It's sort of a 2-layered approach, you could say, to simplify a bit, which resonates with what both Crystal said and Peter. One is the buy-in from the top level. So if that's not there, it will probably be a rather futile exercise, and you got to check whether you first need to build that. So to have the backing that you can ask these questions, because it is challenging the status quo. It is running against the conventional grain of how things are done. And there will be, of course, criticism, questions, and so on, and you need to have that kind of backing. So that's the first level. And the second is this diffusion of the foresight skills and competencies into the organization that can be done in various ways. What I rather strongly believe in is to start rather low key, so not to make everybody the perfect foresight experts, but to get a shared understanding of what has also been called here the vocabulary, the key principles, you could say. So if people have some kind of experience with what it means to be scanning 365 degrees all around you, what it means to interpret those signals, and then secondly, to embrace a kind of what if thinking. That is the key principle of thinking in alternatives. Not to say it has to be this or that scenario methodology or go there, but just to embrace and be able to work with these two principles and bring them into the established processes that already exist for decision making. Bring them into there without saying we now have to do a half a year of a proper foresight with 200 experts and asking the population and so on. No, but bring those principles into the existing decision-making processes. And then I think we can, of course, not from one day to the other over the long term, slowly making progress, but then we can create a real systemic kind of change.
I like that, this idea of creating a culture of foresight within your organizations. Crystal, I saw you sort of nodding. Just the danger of being able to see you, you see. So do you have anything to disagree with or agree with vehemently or anything to add?
No, I mean, I completely agree with what has been said. Certainly with Peter on the type of people it requires to actually do foresight, but both from the people who produce, right, who kind of develop the foresight, who learn to connect ideas and see things, I would say, right? Yeah. So, but also on the side of the policymakers who need to have kind of the courage and the flexibility of mindset, etc., to be able to actually take it. Because their knowledge is also being questioned, and maybe their leadership, they might feel that that's a very uncomfortable kind of experience to have to deal with foresight, because they move from a place where, you know, they're supposed to know, right? And they have to get to a place where, well, there's uncertainty. You have to acknowledge it, that you don't always know, that there's things happening outside of your expertise field. So, you know, you have some ignorance going on there. And still feel empowered to actually take decisions. So it's a certain type of people, I would say, and so it's a leadership competence that needs to be developed at the same time. And I agree completely with Cornelia when you know, I see a lot of I've also worked with a lot of organizations building up their capacity, and you see this like, oh, we have to build like these big teams and these big things. The reality is that you don't get those resources, and if you're going to wait for everything to be perfect, it's just not going to happen. So you start with low-hanging fruit. You start with really finding problems and processes where you can actually provide value in foresight, where you can prove the value, start to develop people's muscles and skills, and then kind of show it works and take it from there. So really building up that culture rather than the one-off big thing, I would say.
That's great. So thank you. I want to shift gears slightly. No, very often when in our foresight world, we talk about macro trends, we talk about drivers, we talk about weak signals, various different words and terms which we use to describe large, long-term things which we're seeing, or shorter. I'm starting to hear that. So if you're looking ahead right now, so when you're looking out, what are some of the weak signals or trends that you would advise those who are on dinner that they should make sure that they're taking a look at? Said, hey, have you seen this, or have you thought about this? If you were sitting down with somebody, what are the 2 or 3 things, or 1, I don't care, or 10, that you'd say, hey, have you thought about this? I'm kind of curious what our table list might be. Does anyone have anything that they're worried about? Nope. I'll give you 1. Okay, we're gonna. Besides the obvious one, which we're all worried about today, what other things?
Yeah. But even beyond what's happening today, we're not going to go back to kind of where we were, independent of the of the outcomes of the election. Let's call it. We're not going to go back to the before. There was already quite a number of trends, that just now accelerated, and with the COVID, etc. So Change was happening before COVID happened and these type of things. So it's maybe an idea that hasn't really completely crystallized in my head yet, but it's one of the things that I'm kind of thinking about. Is it's maybe a big concept, but with a lot of consequences. Kind of how the world order will play out. We seem to think kind of, either we're kind of all together or we're kind of very nationalistic, all of us. But there's this model, and we've been talking about that like since at least 10 years, when I was still at the World Economic Forum, etc. And I see kind of more signs that we're potentially moving, and I'm not saying that's where we're going, but then we're potentially moving to a world order which is a little bit more maybe value based or interest based, and so that the clarity of kind of who's in one camp or in the other might be very kind of different. So, and then the question is like, which countries would kind of choose each other to be together, and on what type of issues would the alliances be made, and what does that mean then for global businesses? It's a difficult situation for global businesses. What does it mean for certain continents like Africa, for example? And what does it mean for technology development? Are we going to have to choose camps? Or so there's a lot of consequences actually to how the world order plays out, and I haven't had my head around that yet, but there's something there.
Yeah, I think that's on lots of folks' mind. Yeah, Cornelia.
Yeah, maybe to first answer in a how do you say, nasty way, maybe a little. Say, I think the first thing we have to understand is, as long as we don't have the big trends figured out, which I think we often, surprisingly enough, don't, which are obvious and on the table, which are around currently climate change, the interconnectedness of the global effects we are seeing, and so on. Please look at those, even though for many things, it's often the case that we can say, yes, we have known. That does not mean we are prepared. And then the foresight job's not done. When we haven't really rolled out the respective strategies, do not have the backup plans in our hands and so on, as we've seen this year, then the job's not done well enough yet. So this would be my first reaction to that. Sorry.
Sure, that's great.
On the more weak signal level, I'd like to throw out two things that I also don't have fully figured out, but one is the tendency, or maybe avant-garde movement, you could say, of regional level initiatives around especially sustainability, taking over the sort of national or supranational agendas, initiatives, and goals. So what I'm referring to is, for example, the initiatives of cities leading in climate change answers, who are cooperating on the city level globally, and often going beyond the national goals that are existing in place and being implemented. That seems to me a very interesting development, to see how maybe there is a new kind of answer, also resonating a bit with what Crystal said about world orders and how do sort of the power structures play out with new actors moving ahead. And the second would be peer-to-peer education, ad hoc led, yet not credited new forms of education, and the question of how we can get that to a larger group of people, because now it's something that's happening a lot for what you could call an education elite, but that could be a game changer for dealing also with many of the challenges we are facing.
Interesting. Thank you very much. This question is purely ego-driven for me. I'm just curious what you guys are thinking about. So sorry about that. But Peter, what do you think?
I'm not sure whether we should be talking about weak signals, but instead trying to set aside something that has preoccupied us this last year, which is COVID, and start to relook at some of the bigger global trends which were already beginning to assert themselves before COVID. COVID is terrible, but it will pass. Whether it takes 1 year, 2 years, eventually it will pass. The big challenge for us is some of the other global trends, which are much more long-term, which are much more profound, in terms of their impact and in terms of their reach. And these, of course, include things like climate change. But just to return to Crystal's point about world order, I think in a way the bigger story is the rise of China, and with it, the contest between the preeminent superpower, which is the United States, and the emerging power, which is China. And I think a lot of the issues which we're talking about, whether the world is going to have a leader in the future, or will it be a G0 world, which has been put forward by Ian Bremmer of Eurasia Group, or will it be a multipolar world, which is again a bit like Crystal's description, in which countries and nations align, not according to whether they are in this side or that side of the Iron Curtain, but according to what the issue is. So these shifting alliances make it very a much more complex world to manage. And is that the kind of world we are moving towards? A second point that's derivative from this US-China problem is, will the world divide into two, a bifurcated world in which supply chains are divided, in which technologies have two sets of standards, in which in at least in trade and technology terms, the world is divided, not necessarily in a political sense, but in that sense. And that's a very, very complex world to manage. And when you have nobody who really wants to step up to the leadership platform, the world will look very different. And I think it will be much more difficult to navigate that kind of world. So that's definitely one area which I would look at. Another area which is quite important to talk about are the second and third order effects of climate change. It's not just that the world is going to get warmer and some parts of the world will be essentially uninhabitable because of extremely high temperatures. But what does it mean for the spread of disease? What does it mean for agriculture? If agriculture gets disrupted, supply chains get disrupted, whole economies will be affected. There'll be climate refugees. There will be water wars. I think these are serious second and third order effects which we should be thinking about. Then there are also issues relating to the global demographics. Some countries are aging, and they're aging very fast. And we know Japan is certainly one of them, but we should not forget China is also aging, and there are many countries like that around the world. And this is going to have an impact on their economies. On the other hand, there are countries with a youth bulge. And then the question is, will they be able to take advantage of their youth bulge? Will they be able to educate the young people? Will they be able to provide jobs for the young people? If they cannot, then there will also be problems. So it's this kind of analysis, I think, deriving from the big trends, climate change, US, China, demographics, where we can identify potential problems in the medium to long term.
So thank you, Peter, for that. Thank you, all of you, Peter, Crystal, and Cornelia. So if we look at these, and some of these are very sobering, right? This is some very sobering challenges which we're facing. How can the public and the corporate sector work more closely together so that we're walking into this new order, this new impact the world with our eyes open? So how can we do this? What would you suggest? What would be the three things that we should be doing? Any ideas?
Maybe one.
Oh, sorry.
Crystal, go ahead.
No, I was just coming back to how Chris in the beginning introduced Foresight. It's a conversation. So if we want to, no one knows how the future will really play out, but we can have some ideas of where things might go wrong, or where we might see some positives that we could leverage. We don't all have that muscle, right? If you talk about the whole population, business, all the different sectors, not everyone has that kind of width of thinking and the capacity to have those conversations. So just being very mindful constantly of having those conversations, keeping those topics on the table, whether it is in conferences, maybe on, I was going to say television, that shows my age, but kind of, having this in like on social media, kind of making sure that people become kind of more at ease with thinking about the future, building that muscle across society and across like different things. It would go a long way, I think. Just keeping it on the table, keeping uncomfortable futures on the table.
Yep. So okay, that sounds good. But we also know one of the table guests has said, but there's an infodemic. All right, there's an infodemic. We're getting stuff shoved at us all the time, either through social media, through our buying, or whatever. How do we get through that infodemic? Is this, if we're going to try to think about the new global world order, there's 27 other things vying for our attention. Or do we worry about it? Do we just keep on rocking as Foresight professionals and hope that our work lands someplace with fertile ground?
I think, Chris, if I may say, it goes back to again the issue of leadership, because if you're going to have to manage an infodemic, as you put it, you really need to have a conversation which is properly managed and which is not totally politicized. Unfortunately, when you look around the world, if such conversations become highly politicized, then it's very hard to see the way forward in terms of coming to some kind of consensus on where the big issues are, where the big problems are. So I think in a way it boils down to the strength of the leadership and also the kind of political consensus that exists within countries. We can have all these conversations on television, on virtual roundtables like this, and they will reach an audience. But if you want to get that big consensus where society as a whole agrees that these are the big challenges ahead, I think that depends a lot more on the leadership being able to maneuver and bring some kind of agreement and consensus.
Okay.
But that's unfortunately something that I can see a lot of challenges ahead.
Yeah. If we could only get our leaders to listen, is that sort of, can we get that consensus? Yeah. But I mean, but it's a serious question, Cornelia, and then I'd like to hear your view on this, Crystal, as well.
Yeah, and maybe if only we could listen better to what the leaders need from us so that they can make sense of the Foresight outputs. That's also a valid question. I think we have.
That's a great question. No, that's a really good point.
Yeah, so on this really tricky one, I'd just like to share that in the ongoing Foresight process of the German Ministry of Education and Research, where I'm chairing this expert circle and where I can report a bit from intermediate results. There's also an attempt to sort of pay tribute to all these challenges we've been talking about, to open up the discourse more to the public, involve them in the sense making around it. For example, there was a large survey and dialogue with the public around sort of how to make sense of the corona crisis and what the expectations and also worries are, and that was connected to a more traditional scientific study on Foresight with which produce scenarios and so on. And also at the same time, it looks at new future issues, and one of them is actually about exactly that topic. The outcomes are not there, but stay tuned. We will also start sharing a bit more in English, so that should be out in the next month, around sort of trust and truth in a connected world. So exactly these issues. And if we want to break it down, I think for what we can influence in the Foresight world, it will be, I think, an increasing art form that we have to really perfect or work on and learn about how we can at the same time create this openness of the dialogue more, so that the corporate Foresight does not only talk to the corporate world and the public sector Foresight does not only talk to the researchers and so on, but there's really opening of the dialogue in these processes. And really foregoing the risk of the politicization. That means that we have to create these safe spaces where you can really do this what if thinking, and it's safe to do so without becoming utilized for an agenda too much, and enable a sort of safe dialogue around it, that people also are open to share and challenge their own thinking. And that's, I think, something that specifically Foresight can maybe contribute to create these kind of spaces for the conversation.
Thank you, Cornelia. So, Crystal, do you want to pop in something else to this, or I'm going to ask you another question otherwise?
No, I think it's a really good question, and I do think not everyone needs to be convinced of how to deal with the future, and it is important to bring the decisions actually to the decision maker and to provide the support. We are only support people to better strategically informed decisions that are being made. But I'm constantly thinking about kind of the push and the pull model, and we've been talking about incentives systems kind of on why decision makers would actually take certain decisions and take the future into account. So yes, we have to work directly with the policymakers or with the decision makers or the corporate decision makers, etc., to strategically better inform their decisions that they're making anyway about the future. On the other side, excluding kind of, the society as a whole, we've seen holds a certain risk. Because decision makers are ultimately, depending on your governance system, I would say, what people think matters, right, to certain decision makers. What clients think matter to the corporate leaders. So if you can also animate kind of conversations around what's really important to the future within society, I imagine that would have some kind of an impact ultimately also on decisions. So it is kind of push, kind of pull, and where do you put your resources, how much time, whose role it is, that's another question. But I think there's something, and there's a lot of collaborative foresight being tried out now in kind of also policy making in certain countries in Europe. And I just think there is something to it to be explored in bringing those two push and pull models together.
I think your point of pushing and pulling is actually very well taken, as Cornelia sort of implied. Well, it's not necessarily what we want to say, it's how those who we're working with need to hear what they need to hear. And very often, what's the right story to tell and the way we need to tell it. So it's hard to believe, but our hour is just about up. And I think I could probably speak with each one of you for 2 or 3 hours all by itself. But it has been really fantastic. I just want to reiterate, because the question I put on the table is how to avoid another 2020. First of all, we can't, because it's we heard some to take away. I'm taking these away for me. Now, to really make sure we're researching disruptions and looking for those trends and having some kind of a core team. Engagement is crucial. And each of you described engagement, and not necessarily each using that word, but this is something which is my experience in understanding how to engage, what to engage, how it's not content, but it's also engaging with process. And it's important that we're looking at both of those. Then to build up the foresight muscle. And it's something we've got to practice, to learn to talk about. Leadership. It's not just those at the top, but it's all of us, to build a shared vocabulary. And I have to say, our shared vocabulary today has been delightful. So I want to thank Peter. Thank you so much for coming in from Singapore. Crystal coming in from Ottawa. And Cornelia coming in from Cologne. And I coming in from Zurich. And to thank our team in Berlin for a wonderful lunch. And I can't wait to see all of you again. So thanks for joining us, everybody. And have a wonderful, wonderful day. Stay safe. Drink lots of water and eat an apple. There you go.
We'll do exactly that. Thanks to all of you.